So we'll see things like eco-anxiety or eco-grief, solastalgia, like this sense of grieving a home that we can't come back to once things start to change. And that can lead to a sense of overwhelm and collapse. And that's when we get those dissociative responses.
Hey there, climate warriors. Get ready for another wild ride on Are We Fucked? I'm your host, Lisa Camillo, anthropologist and filmmaker, here to guide you through the tangled web of our climate crisis with a dose of humor and a dash of irreverence. Are you feeling depressed, burnt out, and anxious from the barrage of world events, or even from listening to our guests talk about the dangerous state of our planet? Oops, sorry. Fear no more. Today's guest is here to help us build our adaptive resilience and work on our post-traumatic growth. Meet Dr. Christine Gibson, a family physician, trauma therapist, and author of the Modern Trauma Toolkit. Known as TikTok Trauma Doc, she's got over 130,000 followers hanging on her every word and has delivered not one but 2 TEDx talks. Dr. Gibson is passionate about health equality and systems change, having created residency programs for underserved communities. She runs the Global Family Med Foundation and Safer Spaces training, where she teaches professionals how to handle workplace trauma. We'll dive into how we can all develop resilience in these trying times and maybe even find a bit of hope and humor along the way. So grab your favorite beverage, get comfy, and let's learn some tips on how we can keep sane. Welcome. How are you today?
I'm great, Lisa. Nice to be here.
Great having you on the show. So we all know how terrible the world is at the moment. If you have listened to the podcast, you'd be depressed by now. So we are here to try to lift you up, or at least trying to build your adaptive resilience. Can you help us, please, with that? We really need you right now.
My whole focus is post-traumatic growth. So even though this is definitely a collective trauma that we're facing, I do think that collective post-traumatic growth is a possibility on the other side.
You even wrote a book called The Modern Trauma Toolkit, which is, I think, what we need right now. Even Gabor Mate called it a gem. That's really impressive because I love him. He's such an amazing man. So what's in this toolkit?
So just like Gabor, I started off as a family doctor in Canada, and we work in really similar equity-denied communities. And it was so obvious to those of us in those communities how much trauma folks are facing. So I began studying trauma, the alphabet soup of trauma therapy, and quickly realized that people were hungry for this conversation. So for me, I joined social media, mostly TikTok. I'm TikTok trauma doc there, but I'm trying to move to other socials in case the Americans actually do shut it down as they have claimed they would yesterday.
What was that?
Yeah, they said they would ban TikTok this week.
No way.
So they gave a few months notice and they're going to not allow Americans on the platform. And honestly, I think it's because people are organizing there and people are truthful there.
Agreed.
So I've been sharing a lot of mental health tips and, just an idea, not just how mental health is happening in individuals, but it happens in the collective body and the collective traumas that we face. So part of my focus on socials has been the climate emergency and ecosystem collapse and how we are all traumatized. Like we can't really avoid it anymore. But the focus of the Modern Trauma Toolkit very much is solution. Like not just this is the problem we're facing and some of us inequitably facing it, but like what do we actually do about it? And I really do think that part of it is actually learning how trauma affects us and trying to figure out how to be in a calm body. Because if we're running around in fight and flight, then we're just angry or we're running away from the problem. And if we're in freeze collapse, which is the other trauma response, we're dissociating and we're shutting down and we're not addressing the problem. And so many of us are in one of those two trauma responses all day. And so I think healing from trauma in the individual will allow us to heal from these systemic traumas that we're facing.
Absolutely. Which one am I? Have I come out on the other side?
Well, and part of it is figuring it out. Like I can never be the expert on someone else's nervous system, but what I love to share on social media, in the book, is how do you become an expert so that you are more aware of what your nervous system feels like when you're drifting towards fight and flight? And what does it look like for you when you're in freeze collapse? And like, honestly, some people cycle between those two things all day. So that racing mind, the tense muscles, the sense that you want to run away from your problems. So you're running away from jobs and relationships and sometimes even your apartment. That is fight and flight energy. And freeze collapse is those days when you can't get out of bed and you can't get off your couch and you can't even get started on your list of things to do. And I mean, I think we can all recognize days or hours when we're stuck in those two states.
So you can swing from one to another because it happens to me as well. Sometimes I just feel the weight of the world thinking this is just too much. And I don't know, I'm paralyzed by it's too much. It's just, I don't know what to do. And we are heading into this direction. And we don't know how long we're going to be enjoying this lifestyle, this food, this air. It's very scary. But other times I just reacted like, okay, yeah, this is great that we're doing this podcast, informing people. We're trying to help. We're trying to see if something changes. So I totally relate to that, swinging from one to another.
And I do think that local movements with awareness and a sense of community are really, really important, because part of what is really hard for us is to face these emergencies and these like imminent dangers and threats that are pretty obvious now. I mean, the city that I live in is supposed to be in the colder part of Canada, and we're, in the mid 30s for most of this week. I'm sleeping in my basement because I can't be in anywhere else in my house right now. Like, there are so many constant signs, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's heat or just weather changes. And for so many of us, that feels very threatening. And when our brains feel threatened, we have these parts of our brain, the amygdalas, they're little kind of almond-shaped lobes in the midbrain. They're what's supposed to scan for danger, and they're scanning the inside of our body, they're scanning the external environment, deciding if we're under threat. And we have so many more messages telling us that we are. And part of what we need to do is to figure out, well, how can I still show up in a generative way? How can I still build community? How can I still stay in the reality of what we're facing while in a calm body? And that can be really hard sometimes.
What can help? Meditation, I guess, exercise.
The tagline for the Modern Trauma Toolkit is nurture your post-traumatic growth with personalized solutions. The first thing is it's different for everybody. So for some people, meditation is just going to let their brains think about all this stuff that's going wrong, both in their past and their worries about the future. So meditation can be really helpful for some folks, and it can get your brain into a calm state. And for others, it can make things much worse. So much of this is becoming the expert on you and learning what works for you. And there's no one size fits all solution. So exercise works really good if you're in fight and flight and you can release some of that stuck nervous system tone. So it's our sympathetic nervous system that's in charge of movement. And so what we want to do to allow ourselves to release the movement is to find a way that works for us. And so for some people, it's exercise. For another, it's like having a kitchen dance party. For me, I get out and walk the dog, because that rhythmic movement and paying attention to his needs, paying attention to nature, all of that collectively feels really good for me. But I'm also a huge fan of kitchen dance parties.
So I'm going to try that.
Huge fan. And what I actually tell my patients that I work with is make a playlist. So make a playlist for something that feels good in your body when you're in that collapse state. So something that is like resonant and makes sense to your nervous system when you don't have a lot of energy. And then make another playlist that's really high energy and allows you to release some of that stuck muscle tension. So when your body wants to fight and flight, it actually sends all of its energy to your heart and your muscles, and it wants to really run away or fight your problems, which we can't really do with the climate emergency. So we end up with a lot of stuck muscle tension. So some people just need to have massages and release some of that tone. Other people need to actually move through that tone. So it is different for every person. So part of it is learning what is the nervous system state I'm in, and then what are the things that work for me to shift to get myself back in Dan Siegel is a psychiatrist, and he calls it the window of tolerance. And that window is when you feel like you can handle the stuff that's coming your way, including these big collective traumas like the climate emergency, politics, the pandemic. All of that can cause us to get into fight and flight or freeze.
I love the playlist idea. I really do. Thank you for that. But yeah, it's shocking what you said about TikTok because you have 130,000 followers. It's so impressive. And also really hopeful that young generations are so open about trauma, about needing help, counseling. They love psychology and are able to analyze what they're going through. And they're not scared to ask for help, not like the previous generations. It's all about a taboo and the myth of a man that can ask for help, basically. It's very sad that all these followers that are using TikTok as a way to express their angst, their anxiety, their worries are not going to have access to you, for example. It's so helpful for so many.
And I'm 100% sure that Gen Z is scrappy little honey badgers. They will find a new platform if TikTok, I mean, it's not available in India already. That's something that has come to pass. So they will pivot to new platforms. They will find a way to build community and have these conversations. I mean, there's been iterations of things like Vine, and they pivoted. I know they will, and maybe it'll just end up on YouTube. Who knows? But I'll keep my ear to the ground because, I mean, Gen Z is having, like you said, really important conversations, and they're willing to talk about the big stuff. They're willing to say, like, hey, this isn't okay, like what our country is complicit in and what industry is complicit in. And they have these big conversations about capitalism and colonialism. And I'm used to that in health equity spaces, but I'm not used to that in like the general public. And younger generations are demanding that we have this conversation and solve big problems, which is about fucking time.
Exactly. We need to. So what is climate psychology?
Well, I'm thrilled that you asked, Lisa, but I think I'm going to have a much more full definition of this. I've actually just enrolled in a certificate program in climate psychology that starts in the fall, but I have studied it to some extent. And I just gave a TED talk linking trauma and the climate emergency and this kind of dissociation as one of the reasons why we're not responding. So climate psychology is essentially the different ways that our psyche, or like our mind body systems, is responding to the threat of the climate. And for some people, they will be more activated and anxious and afraid. So we'll see things like eco-anxiety or eco-grief, solastalgia, like this sense of grieving a home that we can't come back to once things start to change. And that can lead to a sense of overwhelm and collapse. And that's when we get those dissociative responses. So what we might see is people who are overworking, overengaged in social media. They're just disconnecting from the reality that's in front of them because that seems too scary. And they're finding ways to disconnect. I mean, I honestly think it's one of the many reasons why we're seeing an uptake in substance use. So lots of young people smoking weed. And in Western Canada especially, we're seeing a massive crisis of opioid use.
Ah, yeah, I heard that.
And I think a lot of people are looking to disconnect because life seems scary and life seems overwhelming. So I think climate psychology is definitely a part of what's happening to lots of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So this opioid crisis definitely is linked to some very deep anxiety going around of uncertain future ahead of us. And I think also people denying climate change, it is this association, right? Because it's too scary thinking that way. Because when I talk to people about it, even before this podcast, even at parties, they thought I was a weirdo. Like, it's not fun because they think like you're just a conspiracy theorist. And I was like, it's science. It's not conspiracy. And people think you're insane.
This sense of denial, and then it gets to dissociation when we actually actively find ways to disconnect from reality. There's been a deliberate feeding of that. So there's been this kind of denialist advertising and marketing strategy from fossil fuel and other major industries. It's actually helping us create that. So it's valid for people to say, well, isn't the science controversial? Even though it's clearly not, because we've been fed that message through people who've purchased massive media outlets and newspapers. So it makes sense. Like, we sound like conspiracy theorists, but, like, these are facts. This actually happened. They're purchasing lobby power from politicians. They're buying out the media, and they're sending us these messages. Well, it's
Yeah.
controversial, even though literally it's the weather outside your
Yeah.
door that's messed up. It's helping people dissociate and say, "Oh, yeah, it's fine. I've heard that it's controversial."
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I spoke with somebody, another guest yesterday actually about this, about the fact that unfortunately, because of this massive money buying the media and saying, well, yeah, the science is controversial. No, it's not. It's not at all. It's all a scam to make you keep consuming and not caring about what's happening around you.
I think of this as like a systemic gaslighting.
Yeah.
So gaslighting is like a manipulative, intentional, harmful communication where you start to doubt your
Yeah.
own reality. That's what they've done to us. So this is one of the ways that they impose like traumatic communication and this like complicity. They're gaslighting, and it's happening at this like global level, and it is super deliberate. And so like we're kind of in this like abusive relationship with certain media outlets and politicians because they're constantly telling us that our reality isn't true. Where I mean, we know we're facing this. It's really obvious. It's right outside my window.
It's true. I never thought about, yeah, this gaslighting is not just one on one, it's actually the whole complex is trying to create a false reality. Yeah, and second guess what you're seeing outside and how you're feeling, even on your skin when it's really hot and humid. And we're supposed to be in the Mediterranean here in Italy, for example. And it feels like we're in the tropics and something is not quite right. Even the sky is weird. This is just really something not right. Yeah, so what do you generally tell your followers on TikTok? What sort of tips in particular?
So I think the first thing is that you can't really think your way out of a traumatic response. When our amygdalas are busy and telling us, hey, you're in danger, one of the things that they do is they disconnect the pathways to our thinking brain. And so one of the things that we're kind of taught in therapy is, oh, well, you can use cognitive behavior therapy and just think your way into a new solution. But one of the things that I love to share with people is the easier doorway when you're actually feeling like you're in danger. The doorway into resetting your nervous system is the body. And so I love to share somatic or body-based practices because we can shift our nervous system state through the brain, that's cognitive therapy, and we can also shift it through the body, that's somatic or what we call bottom up therapy instead of top down. And one of the things that I've learned doing trauma therapy in addiction medicine, refugee health, I'm in these really specific communities where people are facing massive amounts of trauma, and the body is the best doorway. So that's why I love sharing things like playlists and dance parties and exercise and movement as a way to shift your body, to shift your nervous system. I focus on this quite a bit in the modern trauma toolkit. I love to teach people there are ways, and these are natural ways. Like, our bodies are actually designed to do these things. Tremoring, tapping, havening. These are ways that we can shift our nervous system. So they are becoming evidence-based ways to manage things like anxiety and trauma. And they're just so easy to learn. Like, I think we should be teaching all school kids, like just anyone working with the public, like there are ways so that you're not constantly showing up with a sense of panic and overwhelm or a sense of disconnect. I love how Inside Out 2 just came out and they're like talking about these big emotions and they're giving people new words to have this conversation with.
For those who don't know what tapping is, for example, I've seen on Instagram, for example, people doing tapping. I'm always wondering if that worked. But what else?
Yeah.
You mentioned also other things. What are they? For people who might have never come across them, what are they exactly?
This is one of the things I love to do on social media is to not just like share what these things are, but to actually demo them. So you can learn this stuff super quickly. Tapping is self-acupressure, and you're actually using your fingertips instead of needles to tap on energy points within the body. And so this is based on traditional Chinese medicine. This is 10,000-year-old healing techniques, and it works. Like, evidence has actually shown that tapping can be super effective for many mental health, from things like chronic pain all the way to anxiety. I love using tapping to turn the volume dial down on really intense emotion. So I'll have people identify, where's that emotion? Where are you feeling it in your body? Oh, you're anxious and your heart's pounding and your neck feels tense. Okay, let's tap until you lower the intensity. Just turn the volume dial down on
Wow.
how much you're experiencing that. And let's not turn it off, because that's kind of like gaslighting yourself and saying, "Oh, I'm not anxious,
Yeah.
I'm fine." But let's just turn it down. Like, you don't have to be anxious at like an 8 out of 10. You could have anxiety at a 3 out of 10, get on with your day, feel like you can handle things, and get into that window of tolerance. So a lot of these body-based techniques are ways that you can shift your nervous system. So I have a whole chapter on tapping in the Modern Trauma Toolkit with like a 20-minute video. And I did the same thing with tremoring and havening. So havening is the first thing I teach my patients, because it's just so pleasant. It almost just changes the way your brain feels. So you know how ASMR, like those really lovely
Yeah.
sounds, and even like for me, it's watching like pandas or watching Scottish cows. And sometimes when my nervous system is really jacked up, I will just watch those kinds of videos on TikTok, because that just lowers my nervous system state.
Wow. Okay.
Havening does it naturally, and it's available to you anywhere you are. And it's basically just really, really gentle brushing across the palm of your hand, the top of your shoulder, and across your cheekbones and forehead. So these really, really gentle brushing movements relax our brain. And one of the coolest things for me was when I learned it, because I'm a science girly. I love nerding out on how these things work from our neurobiology. And they actually attached a brainwave electrode so we could see our EEG, or the brain waves that show we're calm. These are like delta, theta waves, and the brain waves that show we're anxious, which are gamma waves. And they look exactly how you'd imagine. Delta and theta waves are calm, rolling brain waves, and those happen naturally when we're in a resting state. And gamma waves are really, really agitated and full of movement, and they happen when we're anxious and busy. And havening, just these really gentle brushing movements, often with some guided imagery. And
Very interesting.
again, I have a whole chapter and video and audio practices. I love to talk about this stuff on social media. Everyone should learn this. It's super, super easy, and it relaxes your brain. So if we got better communally at these practices that help our nervous system relax, we could stay in that window of tolerance, and we could actually face what's happening and more actively do something about it.
That's fantastic. Yeah. What is it? What they call it? Those sounds videos.
ASMR. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what it stands for, but it's basically just like anything that gives you goosebumps and like a really good feeling in your brain. It can be someone brushing their hair will do it, or turning pages in a library, being in a field with the leaves fluttering around. For me, it's like the sound of moving water is so good for my brain. It tickles your brain. And so it's going to be different. Again, we're personalizing the toolkit. So I mentioned ASMR and different ways to interact with nature, different ways to be creative. Everyone's brain is different, but we can get that brain tickle and get us back into that window. We can all do it, but we have to figure out what those strategies look like for us.
Absolutely. Another thing that I do is ground myself. So, as you said, like focusing, if I'm outside, I'm focusing on the birds, sounds, and then my mind it stays here and not up to 1,000 miles speed into the future. So, that's another thing that can help. Just ground yourself.
And again, it works differently for different people. So for some people, grounding is destabilizing, and so much of it is learning your own nervous system. Deb Dana from polyvagal theory, she calls this befriending your nervous system. And I love that so much, because it's not like forcing it into like, you will be calm. It's like, hey, little one, I can see you're suffering. Should we try to shift that a little bit? Should we try to move? Great. Let's see what's going to work for us. Maybe today it's some movement. Maybe it's connection, and it could be connecting to ground, connecting to nature, connecting to a pet or a friend, connecting to music, connecting to our spirituality. There are so many different pathways to calm, and we all have to figure out what that looks like for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Psychedelics. A lot of people now are studying psychedelics to also give a different perspective. It helped me in particular.
Me too.
Great. What did you try? What worked best?
Well, and see, here's the tricky thing, because I can talk about the legal stuff here in Canada. So What's legal in Canada is ketamine, and there's a lot of ketamine clinics opening up.
That's great.
But what the evidence is showing is that things like psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, those can be really, really healing for the nervous system in specific environments. So making sure that you don't have contraindications to it, like family history of psychosis, you have to be pretty darn
Sure.
careful. And then the whole thing is about set and setting. So I've actually trained as a psychedelic journey guide.
Ah, really? Amazing.
I've taken 3 different training. I really think that there's a pathway towards us gaining a greater sense of interconnectivity and just knowing that we are just made up of stardust,
Yeah.
but we're also connected to all the other stardust around us. And like our human bodies are a huge percentage of water and carbon, which means we're connected to these natural cycles. And it's not happening outside of our body. It's all a part of our body. And the reason why our bodies hurt sometimes is because collective body hurts sometimes. And I think psychedelics are one of the paths towards that greater sense of interconnectivity. For other people, it's meditation. But there's lots of different ways that we can gain that sense of connectedness. I also really feel that way when I'm in nature. So I try to get out of the mountains in Canada as often as I can, or anywhere that I am on the planet.
One thing that is worrying me quite a bit is that it just came out today, the news that the Italian government, which now is turning a fascist government, even making CBD legal. So all these incredibly useful natural medicines are being taken away in a time where we really need them. It's very scary.
Well, it's interesting because in some places they're over available. So in Canada, everything's legal and the use has skyrocketed. And some people are using it to dissociate. So like because I work in addiction medicine, so I've got lots of folks who don't get out of their apartment. They just dissociate all day, and it provided them a path to that. What I think we need to figure out is how to actually really provide people with good mental health solutions so they're not medicating themselves and their anxiety, and they're finding a way to use this to access this sense of connection and the sense of community rather than medicating themselves into dissociation. So I think there's this kind of spectrum with how these medicines are being used, and set and setting. So set being mindset matters. If we are already showing up in a calm body, then we have a much greater chance of having a more enlightened experience. Whereas if we are totally overwhelmed and stuck in these deeply anxious states, this medicine may help us be more functional, but it may also help us disconnect from these very real experiences. And we actually have to process the grief and the anxiety and actually be authentically with it. And that's, to me, the difference between resilience and post-traumatic growth. So resilience is when we're just getting by and we're floating. We're figuring out how to keep our heads above water when things feel really pulling us down and it feels like we're overwhelmed. Post-traumatic growth is when we learn how to swim. And for some people, natural medicines get us there. Post-traumatic growth is the series of skills that aren't going to let us bounce back to the status quo because we know that's not working anyway. It's literally killing us.
Yeah.
We need to bounce back to a different state. And that's a different state within community. It's a different state within our own individual bodies. And that's what I think post-traumatic growth looks like, to actually be aware of these like eras of emergencies and like massive disruptions and collapse that we're facing, because it's not just the environment. I mean, it's politics, it's financial system, lots of food systems. There's many things that are at threat. And for us to become solution focused, we have to show up in a calm body, having processed the emotion in a different state, believing different things are possible. So could psychedelics help us get there? For many of us, that's potentially true if we start from that right mindset, which is generative and not being stuck in overwhelm or dissociation. And that's where I think the trauma healing starts us off. So I think we actually have to figure the trauma out before we can get there.
Yeah, super interesting. Wow. I guess what can help is really having also a community around you that can support that, right? So find, I guess, your tribe.
Well, and listen to the people who are doing this work in a really authentic way. So one of the reasons I was so excited about this climate psychology certificate is because Vanessa Andreotti, or Vanessa Oliviero de Mercado, she wrote a book called Hospicing Modernity. Honestly, one of the most important books, because it's from an indigenous worldview. And
I love it.
she writes the book Perspective of a Collective. It's called Decolonial Futures Collective. So they're generating new futures based on the collective indigenous wisdom. So she's connected to First Nations in Canada and indigenous folks in Brazil. And the way that they're decolonizing these possible futures while definitely acknowledging the state that we're in is just so powerful. And then the other person who was faculty that I was really drawn to is Bayo Komolafe. So he is a generative psychologist who lives in Nigeria and India, and he is just so aware of the state of the world. And he ran these programs, We Will Dance with Mountains. And so much of it was like creative and expressive movement through trauma and collectively. Like, who is the community that's going to help you figure this out? So I do think there are thought leaders that are really leading us on a path towards post-traumatic growth collectively. And so as much as I want to share the things that I know, I'm also following. I'm also constantly learning. I just finished a doctorate in transdisciplinary study because I don't think it's any one way of knowing that's going to help us solve these things. It's us coming together collectively. Transdisciplinarity is like not just learning one thing, it's learning many different things and many different ways of knowing. And I think that's part of the solution. And then we get so caught up in capitalistic schemas and we don't really get curious about what else is out there. And I think humility is part of what's going to help us solve this.
Absolutely. In my case, also what helped was getting ready. I'm not talking about being a prepper, but kind of like getting towards a place where at least I feel like, okay, you know what? If shit hit the fan, I could be okay. Well, probably we won't be okay, but we would at least, I don't know, feel ready somehow, at least a little bit ready than most people. I think that was healing in itself.
Yeah, that totally resonates. That totally resonates, Lisa. I joined the city of Calgary. I joined the climate advisory committee because I was like, I need to feel like I'm doing something, and I need to feel like we're putting health and mental health at least on the platform of like, we're discussing about this and how are we going to face this as a community if and when we're facing water shortage or food shortage or a massive environmental disruption. So we do have to prepare. And I think part of it is getting better within our own nervous system states. And frankly, it's why I wrote the Modern Trauma Toolkit, because I think it is a book for these times. I put the word modern in the title because we do have to get ready. We have to be more psychologically resilient so that we can get to post-traumatic growth once more and more of these events start happening to us. And I mean, they're on the horizon. They're reasonably imminent that we're going to be facing more and more challenges. And I think the more that we can actually show up in a calm body, and that doesn't mean we're disconnected from reality. It just means we're like, hey, I'm here, I'm showing up. And building that resilient community locally. Meg Wheatley talks a lot about it. I mean, I'm name dropping all these awesome people I've studied with because I don't have all the answers, but there are some people who are figuring this out.
But it's great because we can actually research more of these people and learn from them and from as many people as possible because we are in incredibly difficult times. And the more help we can get, the better it is. So from this episode, we can get some amazing insights about how we can actually look after our mental health and also try to do something about it. Try to get physically and mentally ready for what's to come. So thank you so much, Christine. You've been incredibly helpful. And many, many of our listeners are going to be grateful for your help. So thank you.
Oh, no problem. And I just recorded a TED Talk a couple of weeks ago. So if it does show up online, I'll help you add that to the show notes or just follow me on social media. But I really do love how you're allowing this conversation to connect the climate emergency and all these disruptions we're facing with trauma, because it really is what's happening.
It is absolutely. Thank you so much for that again. And we'll keep in touch. And now we're part of the same tribe. Wow, what an enlightening and uplifting conversation. A huge thank you to Dr. Christine Gibson for joining us today and sharing her incredible insights on resilience and post-traumatic growth. Remember, you can find more about Dr. Gibson and her work on her website at christinegibson.net. If you're interested in her book, The Modern Trauma Toolkit, you can get your copy at moderntrauma.com. Don't forget to follow her on TikTok as the TikTok Trauma Doc for more tips and practical exercises you can do to calm yourself down and handle everything that comes your way. This podcast series is produced by Against the Tide Films. To learn more about us and our mission, visit our website at againstthetideFilms.com. Don't forget to tune in every Wednesday for a new episode. Make sure you subscribe, rate, and set a reminder so you never miss an episode. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on all your favorite platforms. And a gentle reminder, take care of your mental health. If you're feeling overwhelmed by the state of the world, you're not alone. Seek help, talk to someone, and remember that we're all in this together. Thank you for tuning in, Climate Warriors. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight. This is Lisa Camillo signing off. Take care and remember, the future is ours to shape.